And today we start talking about, which is why we were talking and looking at giraffe evolution over time and Lamarck's idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which a lot of you mentioned in your responses here on Socrative. So let's take a look at a couple of those. Let's see. So top answer right now, this assumes changes during one's lifetime affects future offspring, but evolution occurs at random, new traits are selected for. A lot of the answers that a lot of you have been posting about why Lamarck's idea of giraffe's neck getting longer generation to generation, because every generation the giraffe stretched more to reach the leaves higher on the trees, and that somehow that was passed from parent to child, is broadly laughed at today. And most of you are pointing out, you can read some of these if you like, that the reason that Lamarck's idea doesn't agree with our class definition of evolution, well, let's start out with the review from last class. What was our definition of evolution from last class? Something like this. So it involves genetic change, and that's what's missing from the giraffe needing to elongate its neck generation to generation by simply stretching for it. Like stretching and trying to reach those leaves. A lot of the comments here that are being posted on Socrative right now, in fact, I was surprised, but this is a great example. So using the analogy of a bodybuilder. So a bodybuilder might be really muscular, but that doesn't mean that his kids also, or her kids, would be muscular. It just means that that person has worked during their lifetime to build their muscles. Their kids might have a predisposition to being able to develop that musculature, but they're not going to be born that way. So this is just and of course I know you all have heard about Lamarck's ideas in giraffes and necks and so forth. I just wanted to try to help you refresh your memory about what our definition of evolution was, and it involves genetic change. So something about over time as giraffes evolved, their necks getting longer had to involve mutations that made their necks longer, not just giraffes on their own stretching their necks longer and longer over time. And while I'm here, I want to point out one more thing. So I mentioned to everybody, hopefully some of you have started taking advantage of these movies. Last class, for example, I took my recording, I posted it to YouTube. Here it is. Just a tip, in case this is useful to you. When I post these movies of what we do in class on my tablet, if you go down here to the information section, I post a little outline with summaries of what we've talked about and what point in the movie we talked about that topic. So if you wanted to go back and rewatch when we talk about defining evolution, you can just click on the 1 minute 43 second link and it takes you right there to that spot in the movie. You can watch that part of the movie. If that helps you review at some point in the future, if you have questions, you remember, oh yeah, I had some questions about that topic. Do I really want to scroll through 50 minutes of lecture to figure out where it was? I try to help out a little bit by providing this. So every movie that's on YouTube will have that resource. Okay. So today we talk about Origin Chapter 2 and a few concepts that are critical. Now we've already talked about a little bit about prior concepts of evolution. I'm sure you all love the historical perspective of science. As I get older, I find myself more and more attracted to the idea of not reinventing the wheel, right? Learn from history. But when I sat in your seats when I was a student, I really hated it when the professor started talking about such and so and dates, and I started wondering, gee, do I really have to remember what date that experiment was done and when this guy was born and when he published The Origin of Species? So don't worry about any of that. Don't worry about memorizing names, dates. That's not important. But having an appreciation a little bit for where the field of evolution started and what the thinking was in the past is sometimes helpful. So we'll start with that, and then we'll move on to covering just a couple of case studies that illustrate a few key necessary points of understanding from Darwin. So these four specifically. Hopefully all of you that have taken ecology will appreciate already the necessity of understanding these four topics. But we'll go through it in detail. So we hopefully are familiar with, by having read Darwin's chapter, the idea that natural selection he also called, and some others had also called, survival of the fittest. I actually don't like this analogy, and Darwin in this chapter, hopefully you noticed this point, points out why. Why survival of the fittest isn't necessarily the best term for his concept of natural selection. Anybody have any thoughts or comments about why survival of the fittest might be misleading? Yeah.
It kind of implies just one, there's only one kind of top dog instead of various.
Right, it implies there's the one top dog. So this, it uses a superlative term, survival of the fittest. What happens to everybody else? So it's not really that everybody else is not surviving. And I appreciate that most of you probably don't have that impression, but that's why I like, this is my quote, the eventual elimination of the lineages of the less fit. It's a lot more involved. It's not as snappy a soundbite, but it's a little bit closer to what really happens in the process of evolution. That over time, individuals that are slightly less fit than the fittest have harder times, they make slightly fewer offspring maybe than the most fit individual. And that over time, those lineages go extinct. And so eventually, maybe yes, over broad periods of time, the lineages, the descendants and the descendants of the descendants of the fittest are the ones that are most likely to still be around tens, hundreds, thousands of generations from now. But it's not an immediate thing. It's not this generation, only the fittest survives. Lots of us survive. Questions or concerns about this? Okay. Oh, history at 8 in the morning. So let's jump right into the gross stuff. Maybe this will wake you up. Okay, so we've got mice, rats, fruit flies, or house flies rather, and frogs, I guess. So this is all to illustrate some ideas that thousands of years ago people had about how species originated, how individuals originated. There were thoughts that mice spontaneously generated from piles of grain, because that's where people always saw the mice, was around grain piles, and they never saw the mice reproducing sexually, so maybe they just figured they sprang out of the grain piles. Of course, I didn't want to show a picture of sewers, but the idea that rats originated from sewage was an idea that people had at one point in time. That frogs, especially, I think this one originated in Africa, the Nile, that frogs, amphibians, arose from mud. They generated from mud spontaneously, because when rains came and when fields were flooded, then that was about the time that frogs were reproducing and having offspring. And then, of course, there are the houseflies. So here's a figure straight from your textbook. Hopefully it looks familiar. Right, a not so famous experiment, don't remember the date, don't remember the name. The idea was that flies spontaneously generate from meat. So the initiation of the scientific method, hypothesis testing, what do? So what's the second? The open experiment, you have an open container, it's got meat in it, you see flies. Okay, so the flies, hypothesis, the flies originate from the meat. The meat generates spontaneously flies. So why do you lid the jar? What hypothesis does that test?
What they know.
That meat doesn't generate flies?
It separates it from the environment.
Okay, so it's more specifically testing the idea that something about the environment has to do, so access of the meat to something outside of the container causes the generation of flies, spontaneous or not. So you lid the jar with the meat in it, and you don't see any maggots or the generation of flies. What does that prove? we've tested one hypothesis, that exposure of the meat to the environment causes spontaneous generation of flies. You close it, no flies. Why? What are some alternative hypotheses? So one conclusion from the second experiment, lid versus no lid, is that the meat has to be exposed to the environment to generate fruit flies, or house flies, whatever. What's another explanation for why you don't see flies generated in the lidded experiment? Well, okay, so we're trying to disprove spontaneous generation. So there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. But the fact is that spontaneous generation does occur. Right? I'm trying to get everybody in the creative state of mind. Right? Think creatively. Because in hypothesis testing, we can never prove our hypothesis correct. I don't have time really to go into why that is philosophically. Maybe you've heard people say that in other classes as well. Maybe you've experienced that yourself. But you can never prove your hypothesis correct. You can only disprove other hypotheses. So if the hypothesis is that spontaneous generation doesn't exist, we can never prove that that's true. We can only come up with creative alternative explanations and rule those out. It's all about scientific method right now. So what does it mean if you put the meat in a sealed container and there are no flies? Why might that be?
That's a problem because the flies don't have air, so they're going to die.
Right, so if spontaneous generation did occur and you close the container, then there would be no oxygen. There would be a little bit of oxygen. The flies would probably rapidly consume it, and then you wouldn't see them because they would die during pupation or something like that. So this second experiment doesn't prove that spontaneous generation doesn't exist. It proves that flies need access to the environment to live, maybe. That's the alternative hypothesis. Okay. So now it's time to be really creative. Why did the third experiment happen? What's the difference between the second and the third experiment? So we put the mesh on top of the jar instead of the lid, which does what? Right, it solves the problem. So now you can get air to the spontaneously generated flies if spontaneous generation occurs and if flies need access to oxygen. So we do this and we still see no flies inside the container. Does that prove that spontaneous generation doesn't occur?
No.
Okay, so if you're going to say no, then what's the next experiment to do? So just think about these questions for a second. Which of these statements is more accurate? A or B? So what's the difference between A and B?
One stating that it doesn't happen ever, and then the other is stating that only in these conditions.
So one's absolute and one's conditional. Right? The one on the top is absolute. Pro tip. In science, there's almost never anything that's true that's absolutely true. There's almost always an exception. So be very wary when you hear a statement or see a statement that is not conditional or doesn't have qualifications. Because at some point, somebody's going to find a loophole, someone's going to find that one rare example where that's not actually true anymore. So I prefer B, but that's my opinion. You don't have to share my opinion. But it's true. So this is one species of fly we're studying. What else is unique about this experiment? Or what else could we add to this second statement? So it's one species of fly, raw meat, tested conditions. How else could we qualify how this experiment worked?
Could you change the environment in which the experiment was done, or possibly the type of meat used?
Okay, so
And the temperature?
temperature, right? Change environmental conditions, type of meat. So this experiment proves that at 30 degrees centigrade in a glass container with a cotton mesh, that one species of fly does not spontaneously generate from veal. Absolutely. Because it might be that the next scientist comes along and tries beef, well, older beef, a nice aged steak, prime rib, and then flies spontaneously generate. Or maybe that cotton mesh that they put on top allowed oxygen to get in, but there was some chemical in that mesh, I don't know, it was thousands of years ago. There was some chemical in that mesh that itself prevented spontaneous generation of flies. Some chemical that repressed the growth of flies in the mesh. That's me being crazy. Does anybody believe that that could be true? One person, 2, 3. I've got support in the classroom. Well, this is what I'm trying to get you to think about when I say, let's try to be creative about coming up with alternative explanations for hypotheses. It could be crazy ideas. The point is that you can never prove a hypothesis correct. All you can do as a scientist is rule out every other conceivable possibility, and that's how we arrive at what we call an approximation of the truth. So we've covered a lot of these points already. So Reddy's experiment was interpreted to mean that spontaneous generation doesn't exist, but it only tested that hypothesis under a few conditions. A specific type of meat, a specific type of fly. What else is necessary in scientific hypothesis testing that isn't clear from this figure, how this experiment was done?
The length of time that it was ran.
Ah, the length of, right, so how long does it take for flies to generate spontaneously or otherwise, and how long did the observation of this experiment last? Yeah. How about one more? Anybody?
Doing them all side by side and then control.
Okay, so was there a control? What are the control experiments? Were all of these done at the same time in the same type of container, the exact same type of containers? So how would you control this experiment? What I'd like to see is replication. How many times was this done? Was it just done once? And just by chance, maybe, this piece of meat was able to spontaneously generate flies for whatever reason, and this other piece wasn't, regardless of the fact that there was a lid. So that's why we do repetition of experiments. So I want to know, was this done more than once? So any concerns, questions, comments about hypothesis testing, Reddy's experiment? Right. Otherwise, we're done with the history of evolution. We move on to more modern thoughts about it. So we'll draw on these concepts of hypothesis testing on exams as we examine environmental or evolutionary experiments that were actually done, as we start looking at primary literature, and on exams, maybe on your term paper. So if you happen to propose a new experiment to conduct in your term paper, you might want to incorporate some of these ideas. The control experiments, multiple testing, repetition. So what did I hope you got out of Darwin's chapter that you read? And what are some crucial concepts to be familiar with and to think about as we move through the term? Forget the liposuction. Right. So what's this concept? Why did I put the Newton's cradle up there? If you were in a physics class, what would we be talking about? conservation of energy. Right? You don't create or destroy energy, it just moves from place to place, form to form. The same is true in biology. Hopefully this is familiar to those of you, again, who have taken ecology already. So we have finite resources. We have to make decisions, not always consciously, of course, but organisms and species make decisions about how to use and how to allocate those finite resources. And so the idea being you can't have your cake and eat it too. You get one way to use your resources or the other. If you're going to eat the cake, then it's gone and you don't have it anymore, regardless of liposuction. So later today we'll talk about an example of a trade-off where a species might have to make a decision about how to use its resources. But this is critical for understanding natural selection, survival of the fittest. Right? One example, carrying capacity. And this is a quote, right? I'm just going to show a small selection of quotes and some potentially interesting graphics to go along with them from these chapters. So Darwin wrote, even slow-breeding man has doubled in 25 years. At that rate, basically he says there's not going to be any room left on the earth pretty soon. We're getting closer to realizing that these days, of course, as we get to billions and billions and billions and billions of people on the planet. Oh, the poor earth. So that means that there's going to be some natural selection. Not all of us at some point in time are going to survive. And we already know that people die. Kids die, teenagers die, adults die. And that's part of natural selection. Not everybody survives. The same is true in the forest, where Darwin wrote, seedlings, quote, suffer most from germinating in ground thickly stocked with other plants. Right? So if you are born in a situation where the limited resources are already being taken up, then you've got a really poor chance of surviving. So this is critical for natural selection, making fine distinctions between individuals. If there's an individual who's slightly better at surviving or growing faster than the rest of the plants, so it can reach sunlight a little bit faster than everybody else, that can have a very strong effect on its ability to survive in this sort of a condition. So aside from sunlight, what other limiting resources are there? Right? Mates is a big one. So it's not just food, it's not just water, it's not just space. Because, as we discussed, if you don't have kids, then in evolutionary sense, you're not fit. You don't pass your genes on. So some of the fiercest competition is not simply for survival, but it's for hooking up. Proving that you're the alpha male, or the alpha female in some species. Guys, it's not all about you and how big horns are. So niches also come into play here. Darwin wrote, we can dimly see, that is, it's not very clear yet why this happens, but we can dimly see that the competition should be most severe, competition for resources, should be most severe between allied forms. That means species or populations that look very similar, live in similar places, which nearly fill the same place in the economy of nature. So Darwin's talking about niches here. So here's a picture of a huge variety of different species of cichlid fish that all live in the rift lakes in Central Africa. In this case, these are Lake Malawi cichlids. Look at the variation of colors, sizes. We've got some horizontal striped fish, some vertically striped fish, spots, vast variety of colors. These species are all really closely related to each other. All of these species have formed in the last 100,000 years or so. So a huge explosion of species of fish in this one lake. So how is it, and this is one of the huge debates in evolution, or has been historically, if natural selection happens, then how is it that there's so much variety still here? Why wouldn't by now one of these species have taken over the lake? if it's the survival of the fittest, then why isn't the fittest of these species now the only species in this lake? It's taken over the whole thing. Why hasn't it outcompeted all the rest? Why is there so much variation?
Is there enough resources yet?
So there are enough resources still in the lake to support all of these species. So what's important about diversity in this lake? So in this case, a lot of the diversity among the fishes controls or dictates what sort of resource they consume as food. So you have some, and this is almost exactly identical to the concept of Darwin's finches. So what aspect of Darwin's finches was Darwin particularly interested in? Which body part? The beaks. So you have beaks that are really short and robust, which were supposedly useful for cracking hard nuts and accessing seeds. You had finches that had the longer, narrower beaks that were probably more fragile, but that allowed them to access different ecological niches. They could get different food sources than the finches with the really short, stubby beaks. Same thing is true in Lake Malawi's cichlids, same story. Some of these fish, unfortunately, well, in my opinion, unfortunately for them, they eat by scraping algae off of rocks. So they have jaw morphology that has changed and is different from the other species that lets them do that with their jaw. They can scrape, they actually have, teeth. They can scrape algae off the rocks, and that's how they survive. And then there are forms of fish that live in benthic conditions, so deep in the water, call them near the surface. There are limnetic fish that live in a different place that eat different types of zooplankton, small invertebrates, and so forth. So all of these fish differ in very slight ways, hundreds of species, but they all occupy their own niches. What's going to happen over time in this lake?
Some specific resource will go away, and then they have to compete for a different resource.
So if one thing happens to one resource, say there's an algal bloom because farmers start using a particular type of fertilizer that causes an algal bloom in the lake, and that eutrophies the lake or something like that, then one of these resources for these fish species dies. Now you have extreme competition between some forms of these species, and you have niche competition and extinction potentially. Right? Natural selection, the strength of natural selection goes up when you compete within your own niche. So it's harder for you to survive. Strength of natural selection increases. My favorite one. Close your eyes and imagine you're a chili plant. Okay, so you're a chili plant. What about you ensures your propagation, ensures your fitness? What aspects of you like this picture? What about a chili plant ensures that it reproduces? Okay, so here's seed dispersal. So important for most plants. Because what happens if you drop your seeds right there?
You're competing with your offspring.
You're competing with poor plants. Let's have a moment of silence for the plants because they're not able to move. So they're much worse off in many ways, especially those of you that have been coming to our biology colloquium series over the last year or two. You've heard some people talk about, how tragic it is for plants because when things change, when the environment changes, right, natural selection may be working more strongly on plants because they can't do what we do. If we encounter a climate that we don't like, we move somewhere else. Plants can't do that. And of course, it's really bad if you're competing with your own kids because you really want them to survive. So you want seed dispersal. What about a chili plant facilitates seed dispersal? Fruit. So fruit presumably has evolved to look beautiful and attractive to something that will consume it and transfer, or at least move it, pick it off the plant, move it, transfer the seeds somewhere else. And that's true about the chili fruits as well. They're brightly colored. In this case, they're attractive to birds. It's the only picture of a bird tongue I could find, so you're stuck with it.
Dr. Ross,
Yeah.
what kind of bird eats chili plants?
Oh. What kind of bird does the seed dispersal for chilies?
Parrots do.
Do they? I don't know the answer offhand. Parrots? Tropical birds? I will look into it. Because I think I have some papers that tell the specific species. Is there a particular reason you're interested?
I've never heard of that bird.
Okay. It's not this bird, by the way. This is, like I said, this is the only picture of a bird's tongue I could find. The point of putting this bird on the picture is that all birds, not just this bird, no birds have taste receptors on their tongues that bind to what gives chili peppers heat, the chemical capsaicin. So birds aren't turned off by the fact that what they're eating is spicy. Well, what we perceive as spicy. They don't detect any spice. So that's what enables birds, presumably, to be a good disperser of chili seeds. But why is this a bad strategy? Why is letting somebody consume your fruit to disperse your seeds potentially a bad strategy? How could it all go wrong?
If that organism like is extinct or is in danger or something like that, you can't no longer do it.
Oh, so you're dependent on another species for reproduction. That could be bad, because what happens to that species? Absolutely. Anything else?
There's also the possibility that the seed will be fertilized later on after it transfers through the digestive tract of the bird.
Okay, so the seed's going to go, yeah, how does the seed get out of the bird? So it defecated, excreted, whatever you want to call it. Something poops and the seed comes out. The question is, has the digestive tract of the organism destroyed the seed by the time it gets defecated? And then after that, yes, where did the seed get defecated? Is it in a place that's reasonable for it to grow? Well, of course, that's chance. But birds, yeah, wouldn't it be bad if everything was eating your seeds and then seeds were actually being destroyed and none of them actually could take root? So not necessarily a good strategy. So why do plants, so we'll talk about that in a second. Another question, why do plants produce capsaicin? Why are chili peppers hot? Title of a fabulous paper you should read. Google it. Why are all chilies hot? I think is the title. Go ahead.
They're trying to protect themselves.
Okay, what are they protecting themselves from? Okay, so
Will not spread its seed.
right, chemical defense. So it's trying to protect it. The plants are trying to protect the fruit from organisms that can sense that capsaicin is spicy. And so this fabulous evolutionary thing has occurred. Birds can't detect capsaicin, so they consume the seeds and transport them. But the capsaicin defends the pepper plants from other things that are more destructive.
Include us.
Does that include us? If you're talking about the ghost pepper, I think so. But, except for the crazy people that will eat those too. Although there's been some artificial selection there as well, I think, selecting for more capsaicin production. So here again is another trade-off. Capsaicin, spice, is costly to produce at the chemical level. The more of it a chili pepper makes, the more energy it puts into that process. That energy has to come from something else. So there's a trade-off. So capsaicin in some species actually induces pooping, right? Gets your digestive tract moving a little bit faster. And so some species of birds, the amount of capsaicin that the pepper plant produces actually controls how far the seeds get away from the plant before they get defecated. So if chili peppers had brains, if natural selection had a consciousness, you could imagine that there's actually some fine tuning here of how much capsaicin goes into the plant, how far away the seeds go from the parent before they're planted, essentially.
Dr. Ross?
Yeah.
So this picture, the plant is obviously growing up where the animal had defecated.
Well,
The fecal contents actually provide nutrients to assist the plant in growing.
sure. So there's a benefit there as well. So you get fertilized and you get planted at the same time. Honestly, I don't think that plant actually, that poop was probably there after that plant started growing. That's a pretty old plant, but for that pile of poop still sitting there. But could be. Good graphic nonetheless, curiousgardener.com, check it out. Okay, so there's a trade-off. Here's the trade-off. So this is where evolution really comes into play. You've got limited energy, you can use it in one of two ways. You either make lots of capsaicin, or here's the other side of the equation. So here's the Scoville heat scale, right? It's the chemical way of measuring how many Scoville units, SUs, a pepper produces. So larger Scoville units means hotter pepper. Higher number means hotter pepper. So you've got low heat, you've got high heat. Hotter, spicier. Here's what happens with peppers that produce very little capsaicin. Here's what peppers do when they produce a lot of capsaicin. So what's the trade-off? Fertility, fecundity, seed production. So if you don't produce a lot of capsaicin, you can invest more of your energy in reproduction. So this is the trade-off. Do you try to protect your rare kids, the few seeds you produce, by making a ton of capsaicin and trying to protect yourself? Or do you not worry about protecting yourself and produce a ton of seeds with the hope that many of them might be eaten, but a few of them will survive? And in this case, what we're talking about in terms of predation or the destruction of seeds is not birds in the digestive tract, but instead fusarium, a mold. So it turns out that when it's raining, right here, if you've got low capsaicin levels, this mold grows all over the pepper plants, destroys the fruit, destroys the seeds. Rainy season. But if it's dry, then you don't have fusarium growing, and the pepper plants can produce a lot of capsaicin. Few seeds, they don't have any, little capsaicin, a lot of seeds. They don't have to worry about this mold destroying their seeds. So again, simple concept is the trade-off. Pepper plants that produce a lot of capsaicin produce few seeds, but they're defended against mold growth. And it turns out that pepper plants in wetter climates tend to follow this balance. So if it's a wetter place, you find peppers that produce few seeds but lots of capsaicin. The spicy peppers tend to grow in wet places. In dry places, peppers tend to be less spicy. And this again is an illustration of another point that Darwin made in this chapter, that there has to be a check against growth. So in this case, we've got a mold destroying a pepper, we've got a pepper fighting back, and this is a sort of a dynamic that we're going to talk about a lot this semester, an arms race. Not like the Cold War, but it's the same concept, escalation. So the pepper plant produces more capsaicin. How does the pathogen respond? Evolutionarily. What's selected for in the mold? Yeah, some way to tolerate capsaicin. So if there happened to be a rare mutant mold, fungus, whatever, that can tolerate more capsaicin, it's very much more successful. So then the pepper plant, right, this is the arms race. Then the pepper plant has to evolve even more capsaicin or evolve a different defense against that mold. And there's this constant back and forth between all life forms in all sorts of ways. And we'll look at a few, at least, examples of these sorts of arms races during the semester. Okay. Any questions about any of the topics we've covered so far? So we've got the role of niches, competition, limited resources, trade-offs. So those are some of the key topics. We'll get into more specifics about evolution, of course, next class, but those are the keys. Doing big picture thinking, some review. Pretty soon we get hot and heavy into the hardcore evolution. So in case in point, next class, we talked about survival of the fittest. Well, it's up here. Read chapter 3.1. So that's the only part of chapter 3 you need to read for next class. The first section, chapter 3.1. And there's an exit activity on Socrative. So wait just a second. Let me launch it. This will be quick, and when you're done with this, then for the day, you can take off, and I will see you on Friday. Okay, so that's available now. The room number, again, is 240820. Socrative. This is not difficult. It is for points. Please do last name, comma, first name when you sign in. And if you've got any questions, raise your hand. I'll come around and answer questions.